network. So anyways, nice to meet everyone. Okay, so today, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Alex Baecher, to the RISC community. Alex is a PhD student in interdisciplinary ecology at University of Florida. He was born in Arkansas, and so did his Bachelor of Science at University of Arkansas, and then later jumped over to Kentucky, where he did his Master's of Science at Eastern Kentucky University under the supervision of Stephen Richter. So I've known Alex for a few years now, and if I had to kind of characterize his interests, I'd say he's a broad thinker and interested in just about everything, but he's a natural historian at heart, specifically a herpetologist at heart, and he's done a lot of work on amphibians and reptiles throughout the Southeast region. And so he's traditionally been a field ecologist, but then over the past couple of years, he's pivoted to more kind of theoretical, analytical work. So he's quite astute theoretically and analytically, and he's spent the last couple of years working on a diversity of projects related to climate change, invasion ecology, landscape connectivity, with a lot of sophisticated modeling approaches that you'll most likely hear about today. And so thank you, Alex, for joining us today, and welcome.
Thank you, Brett. That was really nice. Yeah, this is great. This is my first time joining you guys at the Southeast RISCC network, so I'm excited. So I'll get started here. Just to say up top, feel free to stop me if you have any questions. I'll be talking for a little over 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so I don't want you to forget your question by the time we get to the end. And as a heads up, if you hear a dog barking in the background or a baby crying, please excuse that. I have no control over those things. So the topic today is Burmese pythons. So I'm going to tell you about a project that I started a couple of years ago with a number of people at UF and kind of part of the broader Southeastern community of invasion ecologists and managers. So yeah, this project is trying to focus on a new way to predict the spread of Burmese pythons using some of the newer tools. So for those of you not yet initiated on the issue of Burmese pythons, they're possibly the highest risk, at least vertebrate species that we have in South Florida, maybe second only to feral hogs. So just kind of a brief history here on their timeline. The first python, Burmese python, sighted in Florida was actually back in the 1930s. I found an article, I think it was the Pensacola Gazette or something saying that one had been spotted in South Florida. And so kind of fast forward, they really started to be seen a lot in the Everglades and sort of around the Everglades greater region in the 1990s. And then the first evidence came of reproduction, which checks a box to say that they're now established. That was in the year 2000. It was published in the year 2000. And ever since the 1990s, evidence for their impacts on the ecosystem and the environment just keeps accumulating. The first kind of big break was this discovery that the expansion of Burmese pythons is correlated with the decline of a number of small mammals, from 88 to 100% fewer sightings. And this is things like raccoons, possums, I believe bobcats. But it's also been linked directly experimentally to declines in marsh rabbits, a species of conservation concern in South Florida, reducing their populations by up to 77%. They've been sighted widely predating native birds, large wading birds that you can see down here. And they've been shown to have a 5-fold increase in nest predation of birds relative to other native predators, like other native snakes and other predators. They've also been shown to alter disease dynamics of insect mammal cycles, so changing the blood meal hosts of mosquitoes, as much as a 40% reduction in the available mammal host species of these parasitic insects. And they've also been shown to hybridize with other invasive pythons, Indian pythons, so much so that they've found a genetically distinct but geographically undifferentiated population of Indian Burmese python hybrids. So with all of these impacts and more evidence just continues to spill in, there's a lot of interest in figuring out what the future for this invasion is going to be. What new ecosystems are they going to start impacting next? And so there was a good deal of interest in the early aughts. They started working on large scale predictions of Python expansion, mostly focusing on matching the climate of their native region, which is Southeast Asia, and trying to match that with the United States in their invading region. And so here was kind of the state of the science at that point. The first publication, the USGS publication, said that the likely range of expansion is here in green, so covering 3 coasts and about half or maybe a third of the United States. So as you could guess, this caused mass hysteria. And so then this was followed up by a more conservative approach of matching climate, in which case they predicted the expansion to be much less, so not much of a consensus here. But in addition to causing sort of pandemonium in the tabloids, this triggered a lot of, I think, meaningful debates about, what range expansion entails and sort of the roles of all of these factors, like weather extremes, not just thinking about climate on average, annual or decadal, but daily extremes, and how that translates to exposure of animals on the ground or in the air, whatever you study. But there are also questions specific to Burmese pythons about their ecology, their natural history. How does thermal regulation alter or mitigate the effects of these weather extremes? They bask to warm, they use burrows, they climb, they can generate their own warmth to warm their nests, which is unusual for reptiles. But there's also questions not related to climate at all, like what's the available habitat? What habitat do Burmese pythons even use in their native range? They're almost a different species now. What are their movement abilities? How far can they migrate? And we're starting to put a lot of effort into eradicating them. So at some point you have to consider the cumulative mortality of all of these hunting programs. So this kind of created so much confusion and tension in the literature that basically not a whole lot has happened since in the way of predicting their expansion. And so with all of these topics in mind, I think it's helpful to consult just the basic process of invasions, kind of take it back to basic invasion biology. So starting first with the transport of a species to a new range, you think about the introduction and how this leads to establishment. So reproduction, sustainable populations, and then from there, new animals that are recruited into that population then disperse. They reproduce in a new location, establish new populations, and then this spread establishment cycle kind of carries on. And this is, how we see range expansion occurring, kind of thinking about the actual mechanism here. And so, yeah, this happens from going from occupied territories to colonizing new unoccupied territories. And then sort of as all of these spreading animals move throughout the landscape, sort of all of the impacts start to accumulate, impacts on the ecosystem. And so there's been a lot of work thinking about how the introduction of Burmese pythons occurred, and a lot of work trying to figure out what the impacts are on native communities or just on the environment more broadly. But sort of just taking it back to the process of invasions, I think this is really the interesting area of how we can understand their range expansion and their spread. And so we know just from basic community ecology, basic invasion biology, that this process is linked by dispersal, and dispersal determines the connectivity between these occupied and unoccupied patches. And so I think it's important that we think about what the factors are that influence the connectivity between these patches on the landscape. And so first, in order to spread and occupy new territories and establish new territories, you need movement. Those animals need to be moving across the landscape and colonizing new places. And so we know that this is affected by land cover change. The majority of our landscapes look completely unidentifiable from what they were pre-colonization. And also there's the importance of habitat corridors, because animal movements are often influenced by the composition of the landscape, and the presence of corridors can influence the directionality and sort of the flow of animals over the landscape. And so just kind of looking over briefly the evidence that we have on Burmese python movements, tracking snakes in the wild, they found that a lot of the habitat selection is basically determined by what's within 30 meters of freshwater wetlands. And so this is obviously a vital part of their life history. But in addition to that, we've also seen that in their invasive range, they avoid urban and highly disturbed habitats, which is kind of counterintuitive for those who know about the native range of Burmese pythons, and they kind of capitalize on urban areas. But then thinking specifically about movement and the corridors they use, lots and lots of tracking data suggests that Burmese python movements, at least the routes that they use, are often strongly overlapped. So there's these common use areas that Burmese pythons will use kind of as, as a syndrome of how they disperse throughout the landscape. Okay, so think about movement, and then in order for an established population to spread, you need recruitment of individuals, and you need those individuals to survive in order to disperse. So just, what we know about Burmese pythons specifically in their ecology, cold extremes are a big, not concern, I guess it depends on what side of the equation you're looking at, but for them to survive, cold extremes is one of the major factors that we hypothesize to limit their spread. There's also a significant amount of road mortality. A lot of our landscapes are intersected by roads, and pythons are not impervious to those roads. And then, like I said, we've got removal programs that are taking a substantial number of snakes out of the population. So just looking again briefly at the evidence. So back in 2010, there was an all-time record low cold spell in South Florida. I believe in Miami, they recorded below 10 degrees Celsius for almost 2 consecutive days. And this resulted in a big die-off of pythons, at least what was actually observed. There's no telling how many actually died in the wild, but with radio track pythons, they found 59 that died out of, I believe, 99, so it was at 60%. And 36 pythons were just found in the wild dead following this cold spell. So cold extremes are obviously a major source of mortality. And then within our database of pythons, a lot of them are reported and officially accessioned or added to a large database of python observations. The majority of those are on roads. They're very difficult to detect anywhere else but roads. But within all of those records, 57%, what I've calculated, are actually road kills. So several hundreds of records, and they continue to come in. But then moving into our removal program, since it started in 2017, I believe the removal program is responsible for about 55% of the total reported Python removals. So a decent portion, and since 2000, when they started reporting them, it's up to about 16,000 reported removals. So not a negligible number. But so in order to understand the process of Python's spread of their invasion, we need to figure out how to quantify these processes and how to represent them in a cogent way to actually make predictions. And so we can look first at the movement. So quantifying movement, I'm going to transition into kind of more of the methods, but a lot of this project could be seen as mostly methods because we're kind of creating a new model, a new framework here for predicting these spreads. So the results are sprinkled in. So the question here is, how does the landscape influence the movement of Burmese pythons? This is, thinking about habitat availability and dispersal. So using the Florida database of pythons, again, those approximately 16,000 records, I was able to gather habitat data relevant for Burmese pythons. So looking at the literature, what kind of habitat do they use, cross-matching national databases with Florida databases to try to come up with a habitat classification system that's relevant for pythons. And this also includes data layered in on urban areas, roads, and agricultural infrastructure, because we know, again, from the literature that pythons typically avoid these areas. And so I was able to use all this to model sort of the suitability of the landscape for pythons for them to move. And so here we have it statewide, but zooming in just down here to South Florida. Warm colors represent high suitability for movement. Cold colors are low. And so you can even see without any sort of analysis, there's clearly a core here of suitable habitat for pythons to move out of. This is the Everglades boundary, and this is the Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge. So just immediately as kind of a squinty, fuzzy-eyed analysis of the data, there's something going on here. So now then, thinking about survival, this is a bigger chunk of the process because a lot of the work done previously was focused on climate, but mostly they were just comparing native range climate to invasive range climate, or directly comparing the temperature of the air to the temperature that we know results in python deaths, which aren't necessarily the same number, at least the same units. So we wanted to get a little bit more specific here. And so we decided that we're going to try to map the probability of pythons dying from the cold statewide. There are not pythons statewide, but this is kind of hypothetical. So this is because we wanted to establish sort of what is that latitudinal limit of python survival. And so we essentially created forecasts of the exposure to weather that pythons are experiencing by the hour statewide. We got climate and habitat data through time. So for every kilometer pixel in Florida, we have an hourly time series of climate as well as habitat, not through time, but we were able to use this to come up with an estimate of what the exposure will be for pythons. And I say exposure because the temperature that's felt is different below ground versus on the ground versus climbing, a meter or two above the ground. So using microhabitat information and things like the direction of the sun and all of that sort of boring stuff, we came up with hourly estimates of wind speed, temperature, humidity in burrows, on the surface, climbing in trees. So this resulted in about 13,000 GIS raster layers. So It was quite an undertaking, but we were able to use that data to then feed into a physiological model of pythons. So trying to take a model and build into it the dynamics of pythons' body temperature, their metabolism, even their ecology, how much time they spend above ground versus below ground is going to affect how much warmth they're getting as a reptile. So using this, we were able to get expected hourly vital conditions. So body temperature, some metric of their activity level. And again, this is statewide for every pixel for every hour. So using all this information, I could calculate the probability of death because we know from laboratory experiments that once a python's internal body temperature drops below 6 degrees Celsius for at least 8 hours, it results in mortality. So basically the model cold plus snake equals dead. We end up with this statewide map of the probability, the hypothetical probability of python mortality. Because again, there may be some animals here, but this is sort of trying to understand what those latitudinal limits are. And I should say real quick, we don't have all of this data for aquatic systems. So this is strictly terrestrial. Next, trying to quantify the impacts of roads so we can identify regions of increased risks for snakes. So we used, again, that data set. Most of those observations were on roads, and we were able to filter those down to just observations where they recorded whether the snake was alive or dead. Again, about 57% are dead. Then going to the Florida Department of Transit, we could get a complete mapped data set of all of the roads, primary, secondary highways, county roads, and then use that to model the probability of road kills. So here we have in red, higher mortality from roads, in blue or cooler colors, lower mortality from roads. Then lastly, the removal program. So this was kind of one of the early interests in this project, was understanding just how effective the removal program is at actually stemming the flow of pythons. So this is kind of our way of identifying where the mortality hotspots are, where the really, really effective areas of removal are. So there's a data set of every python that was removed through the Python contractor program. This includes 2 sister programs. One is the FWCC's Python Action Team for the removal of invasive constrictors, I think it's called, Patrick. And then one of the water management districts has their Python elimination program as portrayed in the Peacock original series, Killing It, which I rather liked, but the rest of our colleagues in the government had some choice words. So we were able to use all this data to estimate the intensity of removals in space. So here's kind of a more cartoon representation where the contours show where the more intensive removal efforts are occurring. So now we have all the data. We've identified the factors that we think are important for connectivity and for spread. We have the data. Now let's try to put them to work. So we want to model the process of Python invasions. We have a good idea of who the actors are, and we think we can use this data to determine both the direction of where they're shifting to, but also the rate as well. So we want to know how fast they're shifting over time, but also we want to know where the major corridors, those areas of connectivity between occupied and unoccupied areas are, specifically ones that have a high conservation concern. So we use a very new modeling framework. It was pioneered by Rob Fletcher here at the University of Florida. And you can use it to model a species range through time. So it's dynamic. You can model their distribution in space over time and also estimate probabilities of dispersal and mortality, and then get at that connectivity between occupied and unoccupied regions. So for this, I set the origin of pythons. So where they're moving out of to the Everglades National Park, which I know they're not just limited to the Everglades National Park, but this is kind of a simplified representation of the problem. And we set the starting time to the year 2020 and let it run for 50 years. And we use this to predict the spread of pythons throughout peninsular Florida, as far as they'll go, or as far as we predict they'll go, but also our area of concern that we're interested in looking at the connectivity between the Everglades and the Loxahatchee. This is sort of our target spot. So the grand reveal, 50 years of spread of Burmese pythons, starting in 2020, moving into 2070. Right here, this is a very fuzzy animation because this is something like 8,000 layers of occupancy that I had to stack, and it was easier just to kind of aggregate them down and make them fuzzier. But you get an idea. We have kind of every direction there's flow of pythons out of the Everglades, but you can kind of start to see a corridor forming here. So then here's just another representation where the color temperature here is the number of years that those patches have been occupied. So warmer colors means that they've occupied that area longer, cooler colors more recently. So then we can look at this in terms of how far they've moved from the Everglades. So right at the Everglades boundary, it simulated that they occupied those spots for the full 50 years, whereas the further you get out, much fewer, shorter duration of time. And now we can look at the actual realized mortality rates from all of our sources of mortality. So this is going in order of increased severity. In decreased severity. So starting at road mortality, this had the highest gross mortality, the strongest effect on their survival. You can see the Miami metro area. This is a heat map. The redder the color, the more the mortality. So we have the Miami metro area, as well as some of these major highways crossing South Florida. And so then over here to removals, same thing. The colors indicate the degree of gross mortality. And then sort of our least impactful factor was cold mortality. So we get this strong barrier here. Kind of, this is what we're interpreting as the northernmost extent of their survival due to climate. But you'll notice that there's this band in the middle of central Florida that has very little mortality rates. And so we actually see higher survival. So this is showing us the expected survival duration in the number of days. So the units here are 2 days. So the highest survival area right here is 10,000 days, which I think amounts to about 25 years. Which just happens to be the lifespan of a Burmese python. And that's not a coincidence. Our model takes into account lifespan and demographics. So you're going to see the highest survival in this area, and the longest a python can survive is the maximum lifespan that we've told the model. Now, finally getting at the connectivity, looking at potential movement routes between the Everglades National Park and the Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge. Here, this map can be interpreted as the probability of movement, or as the degree of how sort of channelized the flow of migrating animals are. And so we have basically very strong flow or diffusion of animals coming out of the Everglades right here, and then sort of this faint corridor forming as you move northeast towards the Loxahatchee. Now we can contrast this. This is the model's prediction, taking into account survival and movement behaviors and all of those interesting things. We can just replace it with something that's widely used in the literature, to predict connectivity. It doesn't take into account animal mortality or anything like that. And this is what you get. So you get a whole lot of animals dispersing into the metropolitan area, and you get this really deterministic path of pythons moving directly towards the Loxahatchee, like they were determined. So all of these predictions, all these outputs that we have, we put them into forms that are most usable for managers, for stakeholders, for anyone interested in this information. I put them all into these sort of Google Maps documents, so you can zoom in and figure out, okay, we have this corridor here. Let's figure out, is this intersecting the water management district? Is this intersecting a national park or private property? All useful information to have if you're trying to think about, how can we alter this corridor, restore the habitat, or integrate some type of management to prevent the establishment of the Loxahatchee, which, by the way, there have been several sightings of adult Burmese pythons in the Loxahatchee as of last year, I believe. So it's happening right now. So now, just thinking about this approach, trying to evaluate what it brings to the table as compared to the previous strategies. So one immediate concern that you might have is that these estimates of spread seem very conservative. We already know that pythons have been spotted, reproduction has been documented far beyond the boundaries of the Everglades National Park. And so for that, I say that this is an exercise in trying to replicate the process of Burmese pythons spread using a model. And so the results should be just interpreted in the context of what the scenario was that we were modeling here. And here, the scenario was essentially a really large scale release of pythons into the Everglades National Park. So the model kind of naively assumes that there's not pythons anywhere else in the state, in that they've only just spilled into the Everglades, or rather that they are only just spilling out of the Everglades. But it is kind of a very simplified scenario, but this model does allow us to explore the potential for releases of pythons of any size and of anywhere in the state. And so, kind of thinking about that survival map where you have the highest probability of survival of pythons right there in Central Florida, sort of the thinking there is, what would happen if you transported a python and just released it, south of Orlando, based on our model, based on the data, that has the greatest likelihood of surviving and actually living probably a long and prosperous life. So we can think about, hypothetically, if a release were to occur, how likely is that release liable to result in a successful established population? And what are the factors that limit it from occurring? This also allows us to test the possibility for alternative removal program strategies. So the way they incentivize all these contractors to go out and collect pythons, they're incentivizing them to go further away from the established core region of where pythons occur, which obviously makes sense. You always want to prevent colonization before you try to just control established populations, but we could get more specific here. Based on the data that we have, we can conduct simulations and figure out where are the regions in Florida that have the highest return on our removal programs to sort of maximize the economic expenditures of this removal program while also maximizing the ecological benefits of the program. And we can evaluate the effect of habitat restoration. Florida, I think, is maybe one of the only states that has a statewide wildlife corridor, and constantly properties are being purchased and added onto this strategically to sort of fortify this wildlife corridor. We can go in and try to figure out, where are those keystone land parcels that would be, really important for the connectivity of native species, but also the spread of invasive species, trying to, deal with the trade-off between, maximizing the benefit for natives while also, ebbing the flow of pythons. And we can see the realized effect of climate exposure on pythons. So we're using this with current climate, trying to understand how the northern latitude of survival is established based on current climate, but we can also plug in future climate predictions to try to figure out, is that northern latitude limit shifting up as our sort of climate velocity moves forward. Now, for the areas of improvement, sort of the pitfalls here, a lot of our estimates of mortality are kind of based on the assumption that the annual survival rate of pythons is 90%. Whenever I first looked in the literature, this was the only estimate that I could find of the annual survival rates of Burmese pythons. Now, coming back and seeing the new literature, I realized this may be too high. Recently, as of last year, there are data to suggest that survival rates might be more in the 20 to 60% ballpark. So I'm gonna have to go back and fix that. But also, this analysis is limited only to adult pythons because of this data limitation. There were very few estimates. There was one estimate of survival of Burmese pythons, and that was for an adult. So we're working with adults now. But also, adults have limited predators. So it's a much simpler system to work with. Juvenile pythons have far more predators, and their dispersal is also a lot more stochastic. I think adult python dispersal is a bit more predictable or easier to work with. But also, a lot of the information that we have about python's physiology is limited to adults. So for instance, we don't know what the cold tolerance of a juvenile python is. But as people continue to work on this problem, we can sort of assimilate all the new data that's coming in and rerun these analyses to figure out what's happening across age classes. And this is something that's been done time and time again for species of conservation concern. I think the classical example is sea turtles, trying to figure out what the most beneficial age class is for conservation to sort of promote the growth of populations. We could work it from reverse and figure out which ones are the ones that are that have the greatest consequence for the spread of pythons. But also setting the origin of the spread of pythons to their actual current distribution rather than just the boundaries of the Everglades National Park. This is probably the most obvious step forward, but also one of the most complicated ones, because the question of what is the current distribution of pythons is still being asked constantly, and a lot of our colleagues are working on this. So you can put a pin in that for right now, because there's, they have ridiculously low detection probabilities. They're extraordinarily hard to find, and the data are very biased towards roads and easily observed locations. But so taking a step back and thinking about where we can go with this framework, one of our first ideas is that we want to expand it to other high-risk species. And so the first step was gathering data. Burmese pythons are a lot more well-studied than other invasive vertebrates in the state. And so rather than waiting 2 decades for science to catch up and get us all that data, we just asked the experts. So we hosted an expert elicitation workshop to gather all the necessary data to run our framework on other high-risk species in the state. To do so, we created this interactive app. So it's a Shiny app for those of you who use our Shiny applications. So this is just a quick snapshot of it. The users can go in and select their species that they know the most about as an expert, and then they can go in and drag this slider to indicate the suitability of each one of these habitat categories, and then it'll spit out a map for us. So this app was created in part by Josh Cullen and also the postdoc Luke Evans as a collaborator on the project. And possibly one of the things that we're most excited about, we need to understand the current distribution of a species to figure out where they're going to spread from. And so we created this tool that allows experts to actually go in and draw on a GIS layer, on a raster, what the relative prevalence or the abundance of a species is. So here's Burmese pythons, my best attempt at drawing their abundance. And so we get back all of this data. And during this workshop, Steve Johnson, herpetologist in our department, says, can you please do black spiny-tailed iguanas next? Because they seem to have the greatest impact following Burmese pythons. So in response, yes. Here's an example of some of the data that we got back from our expert elicitation workshop. This is all adjusted by the confidence and the experience level of each one of our experts. They were kind enough to say whether or not they felt like they were actually an expert with each one of these species. And so we get this data back, and we have it for now the most high-risk invasive reptiles in the state, but also a handful of native species, so we can actually do kind of a validation procedure to see if our framework works. So just final statements. This framework provides a way to conduct a data-driven risk assessment of species. Most risk assessments are based solely on expert opinion alone, but here we're integrating multiple data sets and using a realistic biological representation of how their invasion is occurring. And we can use this sort of as a gap analysis tool, trying to figure out what we do know about a species, what we don't know about a species, and what we don't know we know about a species. We can also use it to identify priority regions of conservation concern or management, like the example of the Loxahatchee with Burmese pythons. This was a very effective tool for identifying it as possibly one of the next areas of concern. Unfortunately, it is a fairly complicated system. It's both intensive in terms of the data that it requires, but also the actual computations, mind-bogglingly so at times, but we're working on streamlining this and wrapping it up into a more easy to use tool. We're exploring multiple avenues of ways to incorporate it with existing decision making tools. And so we can hopefully make predictions like the ones that you saw today with much more ease. So I want to thank all of our collaborators. The Southeast CASC was a major funder of this project. We've gotten a lot of other seed grant money from all of these organizations, and all of these people here provided just tons of wonderful advice. In many cases, data from FWC, they provided loads. So I'm very thankful to all these people. And I'll take questions.
Thank you, Alex. Very nice talk. Any questions? You can either put them in chat or feel free just to speak up and ask questions. I have one question, and I can't remember about, so evidence of pythons actually spilling outside of the state. I don't think that is a near-term possibility, is it? It looked like the survival was kind of bounded just north of Orlando.
Yeah, I mean, based on our predictions, and this is kind of echoed by some closed door conversations that I've had with some collaborators. The rates of spread, I think, at this point are fairly slow, and there have been a number of observations of pythons as far north as like Tallahassee, north central Florida, Gainesville even, where we are, and it's difficult to tell if these are just monster dispersers or isolated releases. But in terms of the predictions that we have from this, based on the data, yeah, predictions for spilling over state boundaries, at least within the 50-year term, seems a fairly remote chance.
And that's mainly driven by the cold mortality.
The cold mortality, I think,
even though the cold mortality was the less important factor in South Florida, if you modeled outwards, it'd probably become the more important factor.
Exactly. Yeah. Thinking back to the figure of mortality, the cold mortality is basically the only strong driver of reduced survival at the northernmost latitudes. Yeah, obviously the removal programs aren't having the same gross, die-off effect as they are in South Florida. It's difficult to tell with roads. I'm not exactly sure because these estimates aren't on a per capita basis. They're estimated to be sort of gross mortality, so just raw numbers. So you're going to have higher estimates of mortality in areas where you have more animals. So there could still be a very strong effect of roads or even removal programs if enough pythons, if they continue to expand northward and we see these numbers again in the future. But as of now, it seems like climate is that hard limiter.
Any questions from the group? No matter how big or small. Carrie, I see your hand up.
Yeah, that was a great presentation. This is pretty cool work. So perhaps, well, you mentioned the complexity, the data complexity, the computational complexity of this. Is it possible that this process that you've developed, and especially, if you allow input from other experts, et cetera, could this be used in a completely different context, in a different state with a different species, if you had enough of the opportunities to pull in, the geographic and the other data required?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is really me hijacking a very generalized framework for conservation planning, for conservation modeling. I will say, with the caveat that this specific example of its use was developed with one species in mind. And so, we're using a lot of data that are available for this species, and it happens to be a data-rich species, but I could absolutely see this being used, for instance, gopher tortoises. We have a lot of coverage on that species, and just tweaking, maybe what the survival factors are, or what the relationship between their movement in the landscape is. This is absolutely a completely generalizable framework. It lends itself well to invasive species because you kind of think of them as being a propagule that's dropped in a novel place, and you're kind of seeing how far it can go. But it's already been used on Florida panthers, red wolves, other native species that have been on the landscape a lot longer. So yeah, I see tremendous potential, not just with the underlying model itself, but the way sort of I've designed the workflow of how we're going to characterize their exposure to climate, how we characterize their mortality. I think it's a very generalizable system for other species, other locations.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Carrie.
Are there other questions? Okay, well, thank you, Alex. Thanks so much. Great talk. We will end the webinar. Just a reminder, join the listserv and receive updates. Our next webinar will be in January, in the new year. So thanks everyone for your time. Thank you, Alex. Great talk.
Yeah, thank you. Thank everyone for coming. I appreciate it.
See everyone in the new year.
See you in the new year.
Happy holidays.